Topic here is discrimination, segregation, and the origins of the civil rights movement. The terms you want to know by the end of this session include the ones that are here. You want to use the AP framework to analyze the sources as well as complete the charts as they appear within this slideshow. We're going to first begin with the definition of the civil rights movement, which is a movement in the 1950s that starts to advocate for change as a result of the Plessy-Ferguson court case that led to segregation, as well as to challenge some of the Reconstruction amendments to make sure that these amendments were being followed. There's an argument to be made about whether or not Emmett Till's murder led to the start of the civil rights movement. Keep in mind that that's a murder, whereas the civil rights movement is also about legislation trying to overturn the Plessy-Ferguson court case decision. We want to keep in mind the federal versus state tension, the back and forth that we've been addressing in this course, as well as how the Southern way of thinking always tries to find a loophole around the legislation, whether we're talking about the 13th, 14th, or 15th Amendment. This back and forth exchange between the states and the federal government is what allows the segregation to continue. We're going to first begin once again with the vicious cycle. And the vicious cycle is crucial to understanding how Plessy is overturned, because the Dahl test was one that proved that there was a belief in inferiority. The end result would be the overturning of Plessy-Ferguson with the Brown versus Board of Ed decision, which said that you needed to integrate the schools. An example of local state versus federal tension, because Brown, 1 year later, the federal government needed to pass Brown 2 because the state governments argued that integration was going to take time. So the Dahl test is a required image in the AP framework, and what's going on here is that white dolls and black dolls are being shown to black children, and they're asked a series of questions. Which doll is good? The white one. Which doll is bad? The black one. Which doll do you want to be? The white one. Which one do you not want to be? The black one. And what this study does is it proves that at an early age, the young child already has a belief in inferiority and understanding of their place within society, which stems from the experience of segregation. Here we have some additional images, Kenneth Clark, and the Dahl test, which is going to be used to overturn. To recap, with the Plessy-Ferguson case, this allowed separate but equal. This was a loophole around the 14th Amendment, which the federal government passed, and then Plessy-Ferguson was a loophole around that. And that lasts all the way up until Brown, which then the state governments argue that they're going to get to it. It takes time, which is why the federal government passed Brown 2. This is the chart you want to recreate in your notes. What damage did segregated schools possibly cause for children, and what is needed to be successful in America according to the source. The source that we're going to be looking at is the Brown versus Board of Ed decision. And we first start out with this section here, which brings up the 14th Amendment. It also brings up Plessy versus Ferguson. And it says that the state has undertaken to provide an opportunity for an education in its public schools. Such an opportunity is right, which must be made available to all on equal terms. So if the schools are not equal, that's potentially problematic. In this section of the source, they bring up the Negro race and how the Negro race is being denied admission to schools attended by white children, which is a result of segregation. Again, they mention Plessy-Ferguson. They also mention the 14th Amendment. The plaintiff contends that segregated schools are not equal and cannot be made equal. So that's the issue there, that the schools are not equal, which is what Plessy-Ferguson argued, that the society was fine if everything was provided, at the same pace. So separate schools, as long as they were equal, and the argument here is that those schools are not equal. This section, they reference 1868, and you want to keep in mind that at that point, slavery is about to end. And they bring this particular point up because they reference that in the South, the movement toward free common schools supported by general taxation had not yet taken hold. Education was largely in the hands of private groups. Education of Negroes was almost non-existent because of the institution of slavery. So there was really no need to address this particular issue because African Americans were not in school. They were slaves. They bring up the issue of separate but equal. It did not make its appearance in the courts until 1896. Once again, they reference the Plessy-Ferguson court case. They also reference a series of additional legislation here or court cases. We cannot turn the clock back to 1868 when the amendment was adopted, or even to 1896 when Plessy-Ferguson was written. We must consider public education in the light of its full development and its present place in American life throughout the nation. So the question here, are the schools actually equal or are they not? In this section, they talk about education being the most important function for state and local governments. That does not include federal. You don't have any federal involvement at the education level at the state until years later. Compulsory school attendance laws and the great expenditures for education both demonstrates recognition of the importance of education. They're recognizing that education is important, but then down here they question whether or not the separate facilities are actually going to help someone achieve success. Here the argument is that segregation has a detrimental effect upon the colored children. Whatever have been the extent of psychological knowledge at the time of Plessy, this finding is amply supported by modern authority. So this basically is arguing that current information is challenging whether or not separate but equal through Plessy-Ferguson is actually possible. As we finish with source one, you want to analyze these two questions and complete your chart. And to recap, we seem to have some back and forth, a loophole around the legislation. We have the 14th Amendment. Plessy-Ferguson allowed the loophole, and now they simply seem to be going back and forth. And at this point, we have the Brown versus Board of Ed decision, which is going to overturn Plessy-Ferguson. Here we have the Reconstruction Amendments that they were mentioning in the document. The 14th Amendment had come up a couple of times. And to recap, back to the 1870s, when the South was placed into those military districts, this allowed some federal government oversight, but as a result of the 1876 election, home rule was established for the South, which is why you start to see those segregation laws that we have looked up. To recap again, we have the 14th Amendment, Plessy-Ferguson, possibly a loophole around that section. Then this is an example of states' rights once again. So the task here is you have Brown versus Board of Ed. The outcome, schools are going to be integrated, and you want to develop a strategy to not follow the decision. I know this sounds odd, but we're going to try to figure out a way around, because the end result is that some people are going to send their kids to private schools as opposed to sending their kids to a school that is going to be integrated. So what we want to do here is, from the state's point of view, or the Southern way of thinking point of view, we want to try to figure out what would be a potential loophole around Brown versus Board of Ed. I've already given you the example of time, where they're arguing that they're going to get to this at some point, and that's why Brown 2 was passed. The federal government saying you need to do it with quick, deliberate speed, which is exactly what Brown 2 is about. Time, not a good loophole. Federal government saying you need to do it immediately. Here's a quick timeline. We started out with the end of the Civil War, the 1876 election, which gave home rule back to the South. Segregation laws emerged. Plessy-Ferguson ruled separate but equal. That maintained segregation, especially in schools, all the way up until the Brown versus Board of Ed decision with the Dahl case. Plessy-Ferguson is overturned. By 1954, they're arguing they're going to eventually get to it, which is why Brown 2 takes place. And then a year after, you have the murder of Emmett Till, and this is where the civil rights movement begins. And in future classes, we'll be looking at Little Rock 9 and some of the events from the civil rights movement. At the end of this class, you want to be able to define these terms. You want to analyze the required sources in the AP framework using this sheet. And if you want to verify your definitions, use this slide.